And now, you know the story you were never meant to hear. Not a ghost tale, not a campfire legend, but a truth so raw and uncomfortable that most would rather bury it again. His life was not simply a scandal, it was a mirror held up to the darkest corners of family, to the places where love and control twist into something monstrous. What makes his story so terrifying is not just the grotesque bond he was forced to live inside, it's the silence of everyone around him, the silence of neighbors, the silence of churches, the silence of history itself, which nearly erased him until whispers dragged him back into the light. It forces us to ask questions we do not want answered. How many other families have hidden bloodlines that should never have been crossed? How many sons and daughters were swallowed by silence before their stories could be told? And how many towns, scattered across the forgotten landscapes of America, still carry houses like his? Houses where the curtains stay drawn, where the family smiles too tightly, where the truth is rotting just beneath the floorboards. His life may be over, but the pattern he represents is not. Patterns this dark have a way of repeating, creeping from one generation into the next, like a sickness that refuses to die. And if we look away, if we dismiss this as nothing more than one man's tragedy, we risk becoming the same as those neighbors, the ones who heard the whispers but chose silence. Perhaps that is why stories like his still matter, because they remind us that horror doesn't always live in shadowed forests or haunted cemeteries. Sometimes it lives in plain sight, inside families, behind doors we walk past every day. Sometimes the most haunting ghosts are still alive, carrying curses in their blood, waiting for someone brave enough to look them in the eyes. And so, this is where we leave him. The boy who was never free, the man who became both son and husband, the victim who became the accomplice of his own curse, a figure not remembered by his name, but by the weight of what he carried, the most inbred son alive. When death finally came, it did not bring peace, it brought revelation. His passing was quiet, but the whispers that followed roared like fire through the town. For the first time, people spoke openly about what they had seen, what they had suspected, what they had feared but refused to name. And with every retelling, the horror deepened. Some claimed his body bore signs of the unnatural bond he had been forced to endure. Stunted growth, twisted features, a look in the eyes that spoke not of a man, but of a lineage collapsing in on itself. Others swore his children, if they existed, had vanished with him, erased from sight before the outside world could lay eyes upon them. The house stood abandoned after his death, a shell left behind, its windows dark, its rooms still carrying the stench of secrets. Neighbors said they avoided walking past it, that at night they felt watched by something inside. And when it was finally torn down, locals scavenged pieces of wood and stone, not as mementos, but as warnings. No one wanted to forget what had happened there, because forgetting meant risking that it might happen again. As for her, the stepmother, the wife, her fate is less clear. Some say she left town under the cover of darkness, fleeing to start over in a place where no one knew her sins. Others claim she stayed until the end, buried in the same cursed soil as the man she had ensnared. The truth is uncertain, but perhaps that uncertainty is fitting, for monsters rarely announce their exits. They simply vanish, leaving behind ruins. And so his story became something more than rumor. It became a lesson whispered to children, a dark parable of what happens when desire corrupts blood, when silence is mistaken for love, when family ties are stretched into chains. He became a symbol, not just of his own suffering, but of every generation that came before him, of every secret marriage and hidden union that made his existence possible. Even now, when people in that corner of America speak of him, they do so with lowered voices, as if afraid the curse might still be listening. They don't call him by his name. They call him by the title that history carved into his flesh, the most inbred son alive. But silence can only carry a man so far before it devours him entirely. In the later years of his life, the truth of his body began to reflect the truth of his blood. He grew frail, plagued by strange ailments that doctors could never fully explain. His features twisted, his posture bent, as though the weight of his lineage was pressing down on his bones themselves. Some described him as looking older than men twice his age. Others whispered that he bore the unmistakable marks of inbreeding, the kind of deformities that families try to hide, the kind of sickness that cannot be prayed away. His stepmother, his wife, did not weaken with him. She seemed to cling to life with a ferocity that unsettled everyone who saw her. Where he withered, she endured. Her grip never loosened, even as his health faltered, even as the rumors thickened around them like smoke. And still, no one intervened. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was shame, or maybe deep down people believed that this was simply what the family deserved, a punishment for sins that had stretched across generations. The strangest part was that he never once tried to run, not when he was young, not when he was strong, not even when his body began to betray him. He remained tethered to her side, like a shadow bound to its master. Perhaps he no longer remembered what freedom was. Perhaps he believed the lies she told him, that he had no life beyond her, that he was too broken to survive on his own. In the end, his silence became more terrifying than her dominance. For silence is consent written in suffering. And so he lived, day after day, a relic of a curse that began long before his birth. The neighbors called him the most inbred son alive, and while the title dripped with cruelty, there was truth in it. His entire existence was proof of what happens when boundaries collapse, when bloodlines twist into knots that no man can untangle. He was not just one man's tragedy, he was a warning carved into flesh and bone. But warnings are only useful if someone listens, and in his case no one truly did, not until it was far too late. By the time outsiders finally began to piece together the truth, the damage had already calcified into legend. The house where they lived was no longer just a home. It was a monument to secrecy, a mausoleum of broken roles. The walls seemed to hold the echoes of their betrayal, and those who stepped too close felt an unease they could never quite explain. Some swore the air around the property was heavier, as if the very land carried the weight of the sin. Others claimed they saw him, standing on the porch, staring out into nothing, eyes hollow, his posture more like a prisoner than a husband. Inside that house, the rituals of family had twisted into grotesque parodies. Meals at the table weren't shared with warmth, but performed in silence, a performance of normalcy for anyone who might stumble too close. Photographs were rare, but when they surfaced, people noticed the absence of joy in his face. He looked older than his years, drained of the spark that most men carry in their youth. She, on the other hand, seemed triumphant, as if she had secured something forbidden that no one else dared to claim. And yet, the silence outside could not last forever. Secrets like theirs rot from the inside, spilling out in fragments, half-truths, rumors, fearful confessions whispered late at night. A neighbor once claimed he saw her holding his hand in town, not as a mother would, but as a wife might, her grip possessive, his gaze downcast. Another swore that when their church confronted her, she denied nothing, offering instead a chilling justification. God had brought them together. Whether she believed it, or whether it was just another lie she fed herself, no one could say. But those words haunted the congregation long after, spreading like a stain across the community. And through it all, he remained silent. Silence was his only rebellion, though even that seemed less like defiance and more like surrender. People began to see him as something less than human, a figure hollowed out by his own bloodline, a man reduced to an echo. And the more he withered, the more she seemed to thrive. The dynamic was clear, she fed on control, and he was the meal that never ended. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken, or would you have stayed silent like he did? To understand how he became this way, you have to trace the bloodlines back, deeper into the soil, where the roots grow tangled and black. His story wasn't born out of love, it was born out of a long tradition of secrets, the kind that families hide in attics and basements, in unmarked graves and locked diaries. His stepmother was not the beginning of the corruption, only the continuation of it. Generations before him, the family had already been bending the rules of kinship, cousins marrying cousins, brothers sharing wives, a web so intricate, so contaminated, that by the time he was born, there was no way to untangle it. He was simply the latest chapter in a book already smeared with rot. His stepmother knew this. She carried the knowledge like a torch in the dark, convincing herself that what she was doing wasn't a sin, but a destiny. To her, blood was not something to protect, it was something to control. By binding him to her, she believed she was preserving a legacy, keeping the family's twisted line unbroken. And in a way, she succeeded, for when he became her husband, the cycle tightened its grip. What once seemed like rumor became reality, and the curse of the bloodline grew stronger. But curses don't stay locked in one house forever. They seep, they leak. Neighbors began to notice changes not just in him, but in the children, if indeed they existed. Some swore the children were pale, sickly, never allowed to wander far. Others whispered that they never saw them at all, that perhaps they had been hidden away, concealed from the world like something too unnatural to reveal, and through it all, he remained silent. He never defended himself, he never spoke against her, he just stayed, like a ghost tied to the walls, too weak to walk away. And here lies the most chilling truth. He wasn't only a victim. Over time he became an accomplice to his own undoing. Conditioned, broken, reshaped until the line between abuse and consent vanished. The boy who might have escaped became the man who accepted, and in his acceptance, the horror multiplied. What began as one woman's transgression became an entire family's inheritance, a cycle set in motion that others would one day uncover too late when the damage was already irreversible. As the years pressed down on him, the boy became a man in the shadow of a woman who blurred every boundary. She wasn't simply his stepmother anymore. She was his captor and his bride. Their relationship was stitched together with silence and shame, sewn into a grotesque kind of union that the outside world would never understand. But behind closed doors, their household became something far worse than a family. It became an experiment in control, an inheritance of corruption where the son could not tell if he was loved or owned. She told him it was destiny, that fate had tied them together, that the emptiness left behind by his father's absence was a void only she could fill. But beneath those words lingered a truth no one dared to voice. She had molded him since childhood, grooming his dependence until he knew no other path. By the time he was old enough to question, the answers had already rotted. He was bound to her, body and soul, not by passion, but by programming. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The whispers in town grew louder, though still behind cupped hands. Neighbors saw the way he looked at her, not like a son, but like something forced to mirror a husband's gaze. They noticed how she carried herself too proudly, like she had won some twisted prize, and they noticed how he, despite his youth, walked with the heaviness of a man already crushed under secrets. That weight changed him, it warped him, his face hardened too early, his eyes grew hollow, reflecting not the innocence of a young man, but the haunted emptiness of someone robbed of choice. This kind of union was never meant to create life, yet rumors spread that children were born, children who carried features too strange, too familiar, children whose very existence seemed to mock the laws of nature, and whether those rumors were true or not, the damage was already done. His identity was shattered. He was no longer a son, nor a husband, nor even a man in the way most would understand. He was something in between, something trapped, a living reminder of a line crossed, a taboo embraced, a curse carried forward. And when people finally dared to speak of him, they didn't call him by his name. They called him what he had become, the most inbred son alive. They said the boy was cursed before he could even walk. His very birth carried the weight of whispers, the kind of hushed rumors that never dared find their way into daylight. Out there, in the silence of rural America, where the woods grow thick and secrets grow thicker, a story unfolded that most families would bury 6 feet deep. But some things refused to stay buried. This is the story of a son who became a husband and a woman who turned from mother to wife. It is the story of one of the most inbred men alive and the legacy he was forced to carry. Imagine being raised by a woman who is supposed to guide you, nurture you, protect you from the cruelties of the world, but instead she becomes the very cruelty that defines your existence. She was his stepmother first, then she became something else entirely, not by accident, not by misunderstanding, but by choice. A choice that bound him to her in ways that defied morality, reason, and blood itself. People would call it scandal, historians would call it aberration, but those who lived near them in that small hidden town, those who heard the sounds at night and saw the strange family gatherings, they called it something darker, they called it inevitable. There's something chilling about inevitability, the idea that some lives are not written freely, but chained by patterns too ancient to break. In his case, the chain was forged long before he could speak his first word. His father abandoned him, his mother vanished, and into that void stepped the one figure who should have remained untouchable, but she didn't. She crossed the line, and when she did, she dragged him across with her. By the time the boy became a man, he was already lost inside a story he had never agreed to tell. A story that smelled of dust and sweat and old family blood. People in town pretended not to notice. They looked away, the way neighbors always do when something vile festers too close to home. But even the silence had cracks. Children whispered to one another. Old men shook their heads on porches. And yet, nobody stopped it. Nobody spoke the truth aloud. Because once you name a horror, you have to confront it. And in that corner of America, no one was ready to confront this horror.